And they would probably search most heavily at first along the flight plan course. They might go to the side a little, but they could easily be 300-400 miles to the side. He could not know, could not think of how far he might have flown wrong because he didn't know the original course and didn't know how much they had pulled sideways. Quite a bit. That was what he remembered. Quite a jerk to the side. It pulled his head over, and simply with the plane had swung around. They might not find him for 2 or 3 days. He felt his heartbeat increase as fear started. He thought was there, but the thought was there, but he fought it down for the time, pushed it away. Then it exploded out. They might not find him for a long time. And the next thought was there as well, that they might never find him. But that was panic, and he fought it down and tried to stay positive. They searched hard when a plane went down. They used many men and planes, and they would go to the side. They would know he was off from the flight path. He had talked to the man on the radio. They would somehow know it would be all right. They would find him, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Soon. They would find him soon. Gradually, like sloshing. I lost my spot. Let's see. Gradually, like sloshing oil, his thoughts settled back and the panic was gone. Say they didn't come for 2 or 3 days. No, say they didn't come for 3 days, even push that to 4 days. He could live with that. He would have to live with that. He didn't want to think of them taking longer, but say 4 days. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit at the bottom of his tree and stare down at the lake for 4 days. At nights, he was in deep woods and didn't have any matches, couldn't make a fire. There were large things in the woods. There were wolves, he thought, and bears, other things in the dark. He would be in the open here, just sitting at the bottom of a tree. He looked around suddenly, felt the hair on the back of his neck go up. Things might be looking at him right now, waiting for him, waiting for dark so they could move in and take him. He fingered the hatchet at his belt. It was the only weapon he had, but it was something. He had to have some kind of shelter. No, make that more. He had to have some kind of shelter, and he had to have something to eat. He pulled himself to his feet and jerked the back of his shirt down from the mosquitoes could get at it. He had to do something to help himself. I have to get motivated, he thought, remembering per pitch. Right now, I'm all I've got. I have to do something. This is now the beginning of chapter 6. 2 years before he and Terry had been fooling around down near the park, where the city seemed to end for a time and the trees grew thick and came down to the small river that went through the park. It was thick there and seemed kind of wild, and they had been joking and making things up, and they pretended that they were lost in the woods and talked in the afternoon about what they would do. Of course they figured they'd have all sorts of goodies like a gun and a knife and fishing gear and matches so they could hunt and fish and have a fire. I wish you were here, Terry, he thought, with a gun and a knife and some matches in the park. That time they decided the best shelter was a lean-to, and Brian set out now to make one up. Maybe cover it with grass or leaves or sticks, he thought, and he started to go down to the lake again, where there were some willows he could cut down for braces. But it struck him that he ought to find a good place for the lean-to, and so he decided to look around first. He wanted to stay near the lake because he thought the plane, even deep in the water, might show up to somebody flying over, and he didn't want to diminish any chances of he might have being found. His eyes fell upon the stone ridge to his left, and he thought at first he should build a shelter against the stone. But before he decided to check out the far side of the ridge, and that was where he got lucky. Using the sun and the fact that it rose in the east and set in the west, he decided that the far side was the northern side of the ridge. At one time, in the far past, it had scooped by something, probably a glacier, and the scooping had left a kind of sideways bowl back in under the ledge. It wasn't very deep, not a cave, but it was smooth and made a perfect roof, and he would almost stand in under the ledge. He had to hold his head slightly tipped forward at the front to keep it from hitting the top. Some of the rock that had been scooped out had also been pulverized by the glacial action, turned into sand, and now made a small sand beach that went down the edge of the water in front of to the right of the overhang. It was his first good luck. No, he thought, he had good luck in the landing, but this was good luck as well. Luck he needed. All he had to do was wall off part of the bowl and leave an opening as a doorway, and he would have a perfect shelter, much stronger than a lean-to and dry, because the overhang made a watertight roof. He crawled back in under the ledge and sat. The sand was cool here in the shade, and the coolness felt wonderful to his face, which was already starting to blister and get especially painful in his head, with the blisters on top of the swelling. He was also still weak. Just the walk around the back of the ridge and the slight climb over the top had left his legs rubbery. It felt good to sit for a bit under the shade of the overhang in the cool sand, and now, he thought, if I just had something to eat, anything. When he had rested a bit, he went back down to the lake and drank a couple swallows of water. Let's fix this. There we go. He wasn't all that thirsty, but he thought the water might help to take edge off his hunger. It didn't. Somehow, the cold lake water actually made it worse, sharpened it. He thought of dragging wood to make the wall on part of the overhang and picked up one piece to pull up, but his arms were too weak, and he knew that it wasn't just the crash and the injury to his body head. It was also he was weak from hunger. He would have to find something to eat before he did anything else. He would have to have something to eat. But what? Brian leaned against the rock and stared out at the lake. What in all of this was there to eat? He was so used to having food just be there, just always being there. When he was hungry, he went to the icebox or to the store or sat down at the meal his mother cooked. Oh, he thought, remembering a meal now. Oh, it was last Thanksgiving. Last year, the last Thanksgiving they had as a family before his mother demanded the divorce and his father moved out the following January. Brian already knew the secret, but did not know it would cause them to break up, and thought it might work out. The secret that his father still did not know, but that he would try to tell him when he saw him. The meal had been turkey, and they cooked it in the backyard in the barbecue over charcoal with the lid down tight. His father had put hickory chips on the charcoal, and the smell of the cooking turkey and the hickory smoke had filled the yard. When his father took off the lid, smiling, the smell that had come out of the was unbelievable, and when he sat to eat, the meal was wet with juice and rich, had the taste of the smoke in it. He had to stop this. His mouth full of saliva and his stomach was twisting, growling. What was there to eat? What had he read or seen that told him about food in the wilderness? Hadn't there been something? A show, yes. A show on television about Air Force pilots and some kind of course they took. A survival course. All right. He had the show coming to his thoughts now. The pilots had to live in the desert. They put them in the desert down in Arizona or someplace. They had to live for a week. They had to find food and water for a week. That was it. Of course, Brian had lots of water, and there wasn't weren't too many lizards in the Canadian woods that he knew. One of the pilots had used a watch crystal as a magnifying glass to focus on the sun and start a fire. So they didn't have to eat the lizards raw. But Brian had a digital watch without a crystal broken that. So the show didn't help him much. Wait, there was one thing. One of the pilots, a woman, had found some kind of beans on a bush, and she had used them with her lizard meat to make a little stew in a tin can she had found. Bean lizard stew. There weren't any beans here, but there must be berries. There had to be berry bushes around. Sure, the woods were full of berry bushes. That's what everybody always said. Well, he'd actually never heard anybody say it, but he felt that it should be true. He stood and moved out into the sand and looked up at the sun. It was still high. He didn't know what time it must be. At home, it would be 1 or 2 if the sun were that high. At home, at 1 or 2, his mother would be putting away the lunch dishes and getting ready for her exercise class. No, that would have been yesterday. Today, she would be going to see him. Today was Thursday, and she always went to him on Thursdays. Wednesday was exercise class, and Thursdays she went to see him. Hot little jets of hate worked into his thoughts, pushing once, moved back. If his mother hadn't begun to see him and forced the divorce, Brian wouldn't be here right now. He shook his head. Had it stopped that kind of thinking? The sun was still high. That meant that he had some time before darkness to find berries. He didn't want to be away from he almost thought of it as home, shelter, when it came to be dark. He didn't want to be anywhere in the woods when it came to be dark. He didn't want to get lost, which was a real problem. He knew in the world was the lake in front of him and the hill at his back and the bridge. If he got lost, and if he lost sight of them, there was a really good chance that he would get turned around and not find his way back. So he had to look for berry bushes, but keep the lake or the rock ridge in sight at all times. He looked up. The lake shore to the north for a good distance, perhaps 200 yards. It was fairly clear. There were tall pines, the kind with no limbs, until very close to the top, with a gentle breeze sighing in them, but not too much low brush. 200 yards up, there seemed to be a belt of thick lower brush starting about 10 or 12 feet high, and that formed a wall he could not see through. It seemed to go on around the lake, thick and lusty green, but he could not be sure. If there were berries, they would be in that brush. He felt, and as long as he stayed close to the lake, so he could keep the water on his right and know it was there, he wouldn't get lost. When he was done or found berries, he thought he would just turn around so the water was on his left and walk back until he came to the ridge and his shelter. Simple. Keep it simple. I am Brian Robeson. I have been in a plane crash. I am going to find some food. I'm going to find berries. He walked slowly, still a bit pained in his joints and weak from hunger, but up along the side of the lake. The lake were full of birds singing around him in the sun. Some he knew, some he didn't. He saw a robin and some kind of sparrows and a flock of reddish-orange birds with thick beaks. 20 or 30 of them were sitting in one of the pines. They had made much noise and flew away ahead of him when he walked under the tree. He watched them fly, their color a bright slash in solid green, and in leaves, and started jumping and making noise. At first, he was too far away to see what they were doing, but their color drew him, and he moved toward them, keeping the lake in sight on his right. And when he got closer, he saw they were eating berries. He could not believe it was that easy. It was as if the birds had taken him right to the berries. The slender branches went up about 20 feet and were heavy, drooping with clusters of bright red berries. They were half as big as grapes, but hung in bunches, much like grapes, and when Brian saw them, glistening red in the sunlight, he almost yelled. His pace quickened, and he was in them in moments, scattering the birds, grabbing branches, stripping them to fill his mouth with berries. He almost spit them out. It wasn't that they were bitter so much as they lacked any sweetness, had a tart flavor that left his mouth dry feeling, and they were like cherries in that they had large pits, which made them hard to chew. But there was such hunger in him, such an emptiness, that he could not stop and kept stripping branches and eating berries by the handful, grabbing and jamming them into his mouth and swallowing them, pits and all. He could not stop. And when at last his stomach was full and he was still hungry, 2 days without food must have shrunken his stomach. But the drive of hunger was still there, thinking of the birds and how they would come back into the berries when he left. He made a carrying pouch of his torn windbreaker and kept picking. Finally, when he judged he had close to 4 pounds in his jacket, he stopped and went back to camp by the ridge. Now, he thought, now I have some food and I can do something about fixing this place up. He glanced at the sun and saw that he had some time before dark. If only he had matches, he thought, looking ruefully at the beach and the lakeside. There was driftwood everywhere, not to mention dead and dry wood all over the hill and dead, dry branches hanging from every tree, all firewood, and no matches. How did they get used to it? How did they used to do it, he thought, rub 2 sticks together? He tucked the berries in his pouch, back into under the overhang to the cool shade, and found a couple of sticks. After 10 minutes of rubbing, he felt the sticks and they were almost cool to touch. Not that, he thought. They didn't do fire that way. He threw the sticks down in disgust, so no fire, but he could still fix the shelter and make it. Here, the word safer came into his mind, and he didn't know why. More livable? Kind of close to it, he thought. I'll just close it in a bit. He started dragging sticks up from the lake and pulled long dead branches down from the hill, never getting out of sight of the water and that ridge, which these he interlaced and wove a wall across the opening of the front of the rock. It took over 2 hours, and he had to stop several times because he still felt a little bit weak, and once because he felt a strange new twinge in his stomach, a tightening rolling. Too many berries, he thought. I ate too many of them. But it was gone soon, and he kept working until the entire front of the overhang was covered, except for a small opening in the right end nearest the lake. The doorway was about 3 feet, and when he went in, he found himself in a room almost 15 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, with a rock wall sloping down at the rear. Good, he said, nodding. Good. Outside, the sun was going down. Finally, and in the initial coolness, the mosquitoes came out again and clouded in on him. They were thick, terrible, if not quite as bad as the morning, and he kept brushing them off his arms until he couldn't stand it, and then dumped the berries and put the torn windbreaker on. At least the sleeves covered his arms. Wrapped in his jacket, the darkness coming down fast now, he crawled back in under the rock and huddled and tried to sleep. He was deeply tired and still aching some, but sleep was slow coming and did not finally settle in until the evening cool turned to night cool and the mosquitoes slowed. Then, at last, with his stomach turning into berries, Brian went to sleep, just like Callie here. Awesome. Look at, say bye. Bye.